What happens when Hollywood's most legendary tough guy walks into a den of daytime television hosts who believe they can steer any conversation and intimidate even the boldest personalities? Well, you're about to find out. And trust me, this is one confrontation nobody saw coming. Clint Eastwood, the man who has spent over half a century staring down villains, enforcing justice with a squint and a whisper, walked onto the brightly lit stage of The View, expecting a straightforward interview. But what began as a calm promotional chat quickly edged toward live television chaos. The cameras rolled across the buzzing studio, lights blazing like a midday sun over a dusty western town. Whoopi Goldberg, seasoned host and Hollywood star in her own right, smiled wide as the audience clapped and cheered. She raised her hand and announced with show business flourish, "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood." The applause grew thunderous. People rose from their seats. Clint stepped forward with that unmistakable gait, steady, controlled, and full of unspoken history. His eyes scanned the room, cool as ever. He took his seat carefully, his weathered hands settling on the armrests, the slight creases in his face only adding to his aura of ageless strength. He nodded in appreciation. "Thank you for having me," he said, his gravelly voice sending a ripple of excitement through the room. Whoopi leaned in, professionalism and admiration balancing effortlessly. "So, Clint, tell us about your latest project," she began. "What drew you to this particular story?" Clint cleared his throat, his expression turning thoughtful. "It's about second chances," he began. "Sometimes people deserve another shot at redemption, even when society has written them off. We're all imperfect, but that doesn't mean we should be discarded." Sarah Haynes, ever warm and earnest, leaned closer with genuine interest sparkling in her eyes. "That's such a beautiful theme," she replied. "After so many decades of incredible work, how do you choose which stories to tell now, at this stage in your career?" Clint smiled gently. "I look for truth," he said, "plain and powerful. A good story should feel real human. If I can find honesty in the character or in the journey, that's what draws me in." For a moment, it seemed like the interview would continue down that pleasant and respectful path. The audience hung on every word, and the hosts appeared genuinely fascinated by the wisdom of a living legend. But calm conversations rarely last long at a table known for fiery clashes and bold personalities. And seated across from Clint, waiting like a spark near a fuse, was Joy Behar, the co-host, never afraid to stir controversy. Joy shifted in her chair, crossing her arms, her eyes narrowing just slightly, as if preparing to challenge everything Clint represented. "Redemption is nice," she said with a slight edge in her tone, "but do you think there should be limits, especially when someone has done something unforgivable?" The studio air tightened. Clint turned to look at her fully for the first time. A small silence settled, the kind where everyone senses a shift but doesn't yet know what's coming. "I think humanity relies on forgiveness," Clint replied calmly. "If you remove the possibility of redemption, you're not really allowing people to grow. You're declaring that they're beyond hope, and I don't believe that's who we are." Joy raised an eyebrow, the confrontation now brewing. "Some might say Hollywood has been a little too forgiving," she countered. "People come back from scandal as if nothing happened." Clint didn't flinch. "Hollywood doesn't judge any harsher than the general public," he said. "But maybe we should focus more on how someone changes, not just the mistakes they made along the way." A few audience members applauded. The tension thickened. Whoopi attempted to smooth the edges, but Joy was already locked into the moment, pushing for a reaction. "But you have been criticized before," Joy pointed out. "You've defended people some consider controversial. Do you ever regret that?" Clint's eyes lowered slightly, holding a familiar steel. That iconic stare, the one that once made outlaws rethink their life choices, now aimed directly at her. "I regret wasting time on arguments that don't matter," he said, voice steady as stone. "Life's too short to go around policing everyone else's opinions." The crowd reacted with a mix of surprise and delight. Clint hadn't raised his voice. He didn't have to. The intensity was enough. Joy let out a tight laugh. "Oh, come on," she said. "Surely you must understand why people get upset." Clint leaned just a little forward, the posture of a man who has spoken to millions from the director's chair and doesn't fear a single critic. "What upsets people today," he responded, "isn't injustice, it's disagreement." A boom. The panel froze for a second. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate. That one line cut sharper than any action. Movie punch. Whoopi blinked, impressed despite herself. Sarah Haynes covered her mouth in surprise. The audience reacted with a wave of gasps and claps, unsure whether they were witnessing a verbal duel or a masterclass in calm authority. Joy shook her head. "So you think people are too sensitive now?" she pressed. "I think," Clint replied, leaning back with a half-smile, "people should toughen up a little. We used to survive actual danger. Now we panic over opinions on television." The room erupted laughter, applause, whistles. It was exactly the sort of moment daytime producers dream about. Iconic, unexpected, and slightly explosive. But Clint wasn't finished. "I've spent years making movies about courage," he continued. "Courage to change, courage to forgive, courage to let others speak their mind even if you disagree." He looked across the table again, his expression surprisingly kind, not combative. "You might be surprised what happens when you let people be human." For once, Joy didn't have a quick comeback. The tension softened like a storm losing power. The other hosts sensed the turning point and jumped in, returning the conversation to Clint's film, praising his artistic vision and thanking him for his decades of unforgettable storytelling. By the end of the interview, Clint Eastwood had once again proven what fans already knew. He doesn't need to shout or argue to win a showdown. He just shows up calm, confident, authentic, and the room adjusts around him. As he stood to leave, the entire studio rose in a standing ovation. Clint nodded once more, the slightest grin forming at the corner of his mouth, and walked off stage like the legend he's always been. In a world full of noise, Clint Eastwood reminded everyone watching. Clint Eastwood sat comfortably in his chair beneath the bright studio lights, the kind of lights that seemed eager to capture every line earned through decades of grit, resilience, and storytelling. Hollywood had built legends on his quiet ferocity, those moments when he didn't need more than a narrowed gaze or a single word to convey entire histories of pain, justice, or defiance. And here he was, not on a movie set, but on the colorful and often chaotic stage of The View, promoting his latest film. The conversation started warm and engaging, a welcome shift from the media noise he'd grown accustomed to. Clint spoke eloquently about the craft of filmmaking, about why he chooses stories that explore redemption, morality, and the flaws that make us human. Hollywood's already overflowing with fantasy, he said, his voice steady and reflective. "I'm more interested in the things that feel real, the things that remind us who we are and who we might become." The audience hung on every syllable. His wisdom carried weight, like a master gunslinger still in control of his narrative. The other hosts chimed in here and there, Whoopi Goldberg nodding thoughtfully, Sunny Hostin leaning in, clearly impressed. Even the audience seemed unusually quiet, sensing the privilege of being in the presence of an icon. But there was one person who had barely spoken a word. Joy Behar sat back in her chair, arms crossed lightly, wearing a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was waiting, watching, calculating. And when she finally saw her moment, she pounced. "So, Clint, can I ask you something?" Her tone shifted from polite host to interrogator in a single breath. Clint turned slightly, still relaxed but alert. He'd played enough poker in his life to recognize a setup when he saw one. "Sure," he replied. "Go ahead. You talk a lot about truth and redemption." Joy began, sweetening her voice like honey on a trap. "But don't you think some of your past comments about certain political figures might contradict that message?" The energy in the studio dipped instantly. Whoopi shot Joy a subtle glare, a silent plea not to start a fire she couldn't contain. The audience shifted, whispering and tightening their grips on coffee cups and purses. Everyone understood what Joy was doing, turning a respectful interview into political theater. Clint's eyes narrowed, not angry, just sharp, calculating. The same look that once told bandits in the desert that they'd made a grave mistake. "Which comments would those be, Joy?" he asked calmly. "Oh, you know," she replied, feigning innocence with a smirk. "Your support for politicians who shall remain nameless, but who have made some very questionable remarks about women and minorities. Don't you think endorsing someone like that sends a harmful message?" Clint didn't flinch. "I don't recall making any statements that disparaged women or minorities," he said evenly. His tone had changed, still controlled, but edged with steel recognizable to anyone who'd ever seen him stare down an on-screen villain. Joy leaned forward, pressing the attack. Maybe you didn't say those things, but by supporting them publicly, aren't you basically agreeing with everything they stand for? The room was tense now. Chairs creaked, breaths caught, eyes darted. Everyone silently begging the moment to pass without exploding. But Joy wasn't finished. She looked triumphant, convinced she had cornered a Hollywood legend. Clint leaned back in his chair slowly, as if giving himself space to fully absorb the absurdity of the accusation. Then he locked eyes with Joy. If looks could drop the temperature, hers would have turned the studio into an ice rink. "Young lady," he began, a formal address that instantly raised eyebrows. "I've been in this business since before you were born. I have worked with people of every race, every background, every belief system you could imagine, and I judge them by one thing, their character, not their party, not their headlines, and certainly not the opinions that others try to attach to them because of politics." The audience murmured in appreciation. Clint wasn't rattled, he was resolute. The quiet cowboy wasn't riding away, he was planting his flag. Joy's face tightened, color rushed to her cheeks. "Young lady," she repeated, her voice climbing to a sharp pitch, "I think I have every right to ask tough questions of my guests, and I have every right." Clint replied smoothly, his calmness a perfect contrast to Joy's rising frustration. "To avoid answering questions designed not for understanding, but for controversy. You're not interested in a conversation. You're trying to provoke a headline." Even Whoopi tried stepping in now, eyes wide, hands slightly raised, hoping to salvage the segment. Sunny avoided eye contact entirely. The crew behind the cameras looked as though they were praying to every deity known to mankind. But the moment was no longer containable. It was a clash of worlds. Holly, would dignity versus talk show aggression? Joy opened her mouth, but Clint wasn't done. "I came here to talk about storytelling, about the human spirit," he said softly, but with unmistakable firmness. "You turned it into a political interrogation. That's not what I signed up for." The tension hovered like smoke from a gun barrel. The audience didn't dare clap or speak, mesmerized by the confrontation unfolding inches from their seats. Clint adjusted his posture, as if signaling a final line, one that would settle everything. "If you want to have a respectful discussion, Joy, I'm here. But if your goal is simply to stir up trouble, well..." He raised an eyebrow, channeling every iconic frame of Dirty Harry in a single expression. "I think you already know how that ends." Joy had been looking for a moment. Instead, she created the kind of moment she would likely regret. One where the legend across from her didn't back down, didn't retreat, and didn't let her define the narrative. The cameras kept rolling. The audience kept watching, and Joy Behar realized she had just tried to pick a fight with Clint Eastwood, and Clint Eastwood does not lose those. The tension on set had escalated to the point where even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. Sarah Haynes, sensing disaster rapidly approaching, jumped in with a bright, nervous smile plastered across her face. "Clint," she said, her voice lifting an octave in a desperate attempt to reset the energy, "your films have entertained millions of people around the world. What has been the most rewarding part of your career? The connection with the audience, the creative process." It was an olive branch, a lifeline to bring the conversation back to safer terrain. But Clint Eastwood wasn't done speaking his truth. He turned to Sarah with a polite nod, acknowledging the effort. "You know what, Sarah, I'll answer that." His voice remained calm, but there was an unmistakable weight behind his words. "The most rewarding part has been working with professionals, people who understand that respect is earned, not demanded, people who don't hide behind a panel of co-hosts to take cheap shots at their guests." Joy's jaw dropped open. She blinked several times, stunned that the man across from her, legendary, composed, usually reserved, had called her out so directly. Her voice quivered with anger as she sputtered, "Cheap shots? I'm asking legitimate questions about your political views. No." Clint corrected firmly, tilting his head just slightly. "You're trying to create a viral moment for your social media clips. There's a difference between asking about someone's perspective and trying to ambush them." Joy scoffed, shaking her head. "I'm not ambushing anyone. I'm doing my job." Clint leaned forward just enough to show he was fully engaged. and fully in control. Your job," he said slowly, "is to interview guests about why they're here. I came to talk about a film I'm proud of, a film that explores redemption and forgiveness. Subjects I think matter, but you—" He paused, his eyes narrowing with the precision of a seasoned gunslinger, aiming before he fires. "You would rather drag this into politics to create drama." Again, Whoopi Goldberg attempted to regain control of the runaway train. She raised her hands slightly, palms outward, trying to smooth over the situation with a voice that carried the practiced calm of someone who had diffused far too many on-air explosions. "The film does sound fascinating, Clint," she said gently. "Can you tell us about the main character?" Clint accepted the pivot, but didn't break eye contact with Joy as he answered. "It's about a man who's made mistakes," he began, "but he's trying to do better. He's trying to rebuild his life honestly, and sometimes—" He continued, his gaze still locked with Joy's like a silent showdown in an old western. "The biggest obstacles aren't the things you've done, but the people who want to keep you defined by your past, people who refuse to allow growth." The metaphor struck the audience like a revelation. People glanced at Joy. She knew, everyone knew, that he was talking about her. Joy shifted uncomfortably, her chair squeaking beneath the weight of her irritation. "That's a beautiful message," Sarah said quickly, seizing the opportunity to steer the mood back into positive territory. Redemption is such a powerful storytelling theme, but Joy Behar wasn't ready to retreat. Not yet. She leaned forward, eyebrows raised, ready to strike again. "Speaking of redemption, don't you think some people are beyond it? I mean, if someone consistently supports divisive politics, at what point do we stop giving them chances? Someone like that isn't changing, right?" The studio air already cold, dropped several more degrees. Clint's jaw tensed, just barely, but that subtle movement spoke louder than any shout. He nodded thoughtfully, then asked with razor-sharp precision, "Are we talking about the character in my film? Or are you trying to make this personal again?" "I'm talking about accountability," Joy declared, wearing a look of triumph, convinced she had regained control. "Public figures have a responsibility to their fans." "Oh, do they now?" Clint's voice dipped into that quiet danger audiences knew well, the voice that, historically, preceded a cinematic takedown. "And what responsibility," he asked, each word laid down with calm authority, "do television hosts have to their guests?" Joy fired back instantly, thinking speed would give her strength. "To ask tough questions that matter, no." Clint replied instantly, no hesitation, no wavering, just a single syllable of absolute conviction. "Your responsibility is to honor the reason someone sits in that chair, to give them the space to share their work, their art, their message, instead." He motioned calmly toward the desk. "You choose to use this platform to interrogate, to provoke, to divide?" Joy opened her mouth, but Clint raised a hand lightly, not to silence her, but to finish his thought. "And the irony," he said, voice low enough that everyone leaned in to hear, "is that you preach accountability while doing everything in your power to avoid it." Whoopi sighed, the kind of sigh that comes from knowing the train has already hit the cliff and there is no pulling it back. The audience was frozen. No laughter, no applause, just stunned silence. For the first time since the interview began, Joy Behar didn't know what to say. Clint Eastwood adjusted the cuff of his jacket casually, as though the most explosive exchange on daytime television was merely a warm-up. He glanced around the studio, at the audience, the co-hosts, the lights, then returned his gaze one final time to Joy. "You invited me here to talk about a story of redemption," he said with measured clarity. "Maybe you should try listening to one." And with that, the silence broke, not with applause, not with cheers, but with a stunned, breathless realization. Joy had not just picked the wrong moment. She had picked the wrong man. Eastwood didn't raise his voice. He didn't slam the table or shout back. He simply looked at Joy Behar with the cold, steady expression of a man who had survived far harder battles than a morning talk show. "It's about respect," he said firmly, each word crisp as a snapped branch, "to treat people with basic human decency, something you seem to have forgotten." That line landed like a hammer. The other hosts exchanged frantic, wide-eyed glances. They weren't just in uncomfortable territory, they were in uncharted territory. Whoopi Goldberg waved her hand subtly toward the producers behind the cameras, mouthing "wrap it up," but Joy Joy was too intoxicated by the confrontation to notice the panic around her. "Human decency," she repeated, laughing a sharp, humorless laugh. "That's rich coming from someone who spent decades playing violent tough guys and glorifying gun culture." The audience gasped loudly this time. Even the View's standards had a threshold, and this was starting to smell like a career-ending moment. Clint didn't blink. He sat back in his chair, studying Joy like a director trying to determine whether an actor could handle the next scene. What he saw clearly didn't impress him. "You know what your problem is, Joy?" he asked, voice almost soft. She crossed her arms, smirking with false confidence. "Enlighten me. You think being loud makes you right. You think confrontation makes you courageous, but all it really makes you." He paused, letting the moment stretch tight as a drawn bow. "Is a bully hiding behind a microphone?" Joy's composure cracked. "Excuse me," she snapped, voice jumping into a pitch that made even the microphones whine. "You heard me," Eastwood replied, controlled as ever. "You sit here day after day taking shots at people who can't really fight back, because they're guests on your turf. You think that makes you powerful." He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "All it makes you is small." Joy shot to her feet, palms flat against the table, face blazing red. "How dare you call me small? I've been doing this job for years. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, celebrities, and how many of them walked away feeling respected?" Clint countered instantly. How many left thinking they'd been treated like human beings, like their time here mattered? Joy opened her mouth, nothing came out. The audience could practically hear the gears grinding, choking on their own friction. "I don't have to take this from you," she finally barked. "You're absolutely right," Clint replied, standing up calmly, the movement somehow grander than any dramatic exit scripted in Hollywood. "You don't have to take anything from me, just like I don't have to stand here and let you turn a discussion about art into your personal political theater." Whoopi finally interjected, voice low, pleading. Clint Joy, let's all take a breath, but Clint shook his head. "No, Whoopi. I think Joy and I understand each other perfectly now." Joy trembled with fury. "You can't just walk out because you don't like the questions." Clint gave her the squint. "The one that launched 1,000 movie posters and ended even more villains. Watch me." He began unclipping his microphone. Joy pointed at him with a shaking finger. "This is live television. You can't just leave." Clint paused mid-motion, eyes locked on hers. "Can't I?" That was the moment, the shift. The audience knew it. The hosts knew it. Cameras zoomed in automatically, recognizing the gravity without direction. "That's another thing you don't understand, Joy," Clint continued. "Real power isn't cornering someone on camera. Real power," he lifted the microphone from his collar, "is knowing when to walk away." Joy scrambled for a last-ditch defense. "If you walk off, it'll look like you can't handle tough questions." Clint slowly turned his head not toward Joy, but directly into the main studio camera. The room fell silent, folks watching at home. He said, voice controlled and quiet enough to demand attention, "I came here to talk about a film that means something to me. Something crafted with care, with passion, with heart." He gestured toward Joy with a subtle flick of his hand. "Instead, I got ambushed by someone who's more interested in viral clips and personal agendas than an actual conversation." The audience murmured not boos, not cheers, but stunned acknowledgement. "That tells you everything you need to know about the state of television today," he added. Then, turning back to Joy, he delivered the final blow. "As for handling tough questions, lady," he leaned in just enough for the cameras to catch the glint in his eyes, "I've been handling real tough questions since before you knew what a microphone was." A single heartbeat passed before Clint concluded. The difference is they were usually asked by professionals. Joy looked like she might combust. Her face was now a level of purple typically reserved for poorly cooked eggplants. "You arrogant has-been," she screeched. "You think you can just insult me on my own show?" Clint smiled, small, measured, lethal. "I didn't insult you," he said softly. "I described you." With that, he set the mic on the table. No slam, no theatrics, just a quiet, confident placement that somehow echoed louder than a drop the mic moment ever could. Then Clint Eastwood, Hollywood icon, master of the silent stare, unshakable legend, turned his back and walked out. The camera tried to cut wide, but the studio was too stunned to react fast enough. Viewers at home saw him take 3 full steps toward the exit, before the show abruptly cut to commercial. A final shot of Joy's stunned silence lingered half a second too long. Daytime TV history had just been made.